First thing I was going to show is how to make some camera rigs, and I'll bring in a test area, which is a good tip, by the way. If you have separate elements that you want to use in your scene, it'd be useful to have some things from the scene to be able to play with, to test and things, like some of the other logic pieces and whatnot. Then it's good to just have an element where you can just search and bring it in and plonk it in, and then you can make your changes and test and things like that. And then when you're finished, you just delete it and save, and that's done. But you don't have to keep on making a tweak, go back to your scene, come back, make a tweak, and so on and so forth. So I've got this first person view. There's a bit of the procedural animation for the legs and all this stuff. And it works fine. There is an easier way of, if you just want to be able to walk around, which I've made a tutorial of before. But if you want to kind of have more control over the camera, things like that, then you can make this kind of rig, and then it can just be adapted for those other situations. So let's start making that. So we'll start off with a puppet. Put it down there. Now we use the puppet to for the main controls, and then use the rig to just control the camera. This makes it a lot easier for a number of reasons. The puppet has some special code in it, so it never falls over or whatever. It just always stays upright, and things like that. And it has built-in animations and jumping and whatnot. So we'll use that to our advantage when we make our rig. So now we'll start making the rig using the grid snap, because this lets us easily line things up to the center of objects and stuff. So I'll stamp a cube there, and I'll copy this up like that. Now we'll have this cube to kind of anchor where the whole rig is, and then this cube will look up and down and have the actual camera on it. So now we'll go into the connectors and add a motor bolt from the bottom one to the top one. Now the ends of these, it doesn't really matter where they are. They just kind of are there to help you kind of visualize it. But when you actually stamp one of these bolts, the first one you stamp is yellow, which is the parent object, like that. And then the second one you stamp is blue, which is the child object. The child object will become movable when you set it as a child. And that's the one that will move relative to the parent. So if I just move that like that, I'll drag this to the center point of the side and use triangle to make sure it's perfectly aligned. If I turn off the grid, like, you could move it any way you like, but if you turn on the grid snap, then you can, while holding something, press triangle and it will snap to the nearest point. So then we can get this perfectly aligned like that. And now if we play time, you'll see the child moves, but the parent doesn't move. So now we'll group all of that and scope in, and we'll have a microchip to hold all our logic stuff. And I'll move it over here, and I'll put that to the side like that. So actually first we'll just add the actual camera. So let's get a camera gadget from over here and use triangle. We'll align to this object now, and then use triangle so that we can put this in the center of that cube. And we can turn on X-ray to see that we can actually move it like that and make sure it's aligned, and that's all fine. So now we want to add, we're going to teleport this to the actual puppet. So let's add a tag in here so that we have something to teleport to. So the tags are in here, so that's in gadgets, and then sensors and input tag. A tag is basically a point in space, so at the moment it's there, but we can move it around, and it has an orientation as well. So if I turn off the grid and put this at a squiffy angle, then I can turn on the grid, and it's now that object is no longer part of the oriented correctly according to the grid. So then you can grab it with R2, and while holding press triangle, and it will reorient itself. Or you can orient the grid to the object with L1 and triangle. So now the grid is as squiffy as that is, so you can perfectly align things to this object. Now we're going to do that for the puppet to make sure that we can move this tag easier along the kind of center line like that on the grid. So now we can, while this tag is selected, or while its tweak menu is open, then the gizmo appears. And you can move that around independently of the gadget itself. So there I'll use triangle to align it to the grid again, and we'll put it there. Now this will be kind of the target of everything to do with the orientation of this. So we're not going to rotate this around like that. We're going to let the puppet do its thing and match the puppet's orientation. So we'll go and add a teleporter, and we want this to affect the group entirely. So that's affecting the whole group, but we want the dot of this tag, we want this teleporter to make this dot match that dot, but we want that dot in the chest to be the center of the where you can rotate the camera from, which is this kind of axis here. So we can move this and use triangle to snap it to the grid again, like that. So that's all that does. So it puts that dot on the tag dot perfectly, overlaps them. But we actually want this to be kind of more in the head because it's a first person camera. So I'm just going to align the grid to the puppet using L1 and triangle, and then we can use precise move. So this will use the same grid as we already set up, but it will snap to those axes, but it won't kind of snap us to different points like the grid would. So now we can just move it up like that, and now we play time, and now that camera is at the same point as the head. We also want it to match the orientation so that when we turn the puppet, it doesn't keep looking in the wrong direction. So if we turn on match target orientation, that'll do that. But you can see the camera's facing the wrong way now. So we can change the orientation of the tag or change the orientation of the teleporter. So you can see the tag Z is pointing that way forwards. So we want Z to be pointing forwards on the camera as well. So let's just move that around on the grid. There we go. And now the camera is pointing forwards. So the teleporting is done. But you can see that the camera doesn't actually spin around with this cube, which we'll need it to do. So we scope in here, and now this, while holding this, we can press L1 and X, and you can see while we hold L1, there's the box highlights like that, and then we press X and it scopes into that box while holding this object. So now this object is in a group with the box, and the connector automatically changes to affect the box and affect the group instead of the box. So now the camera moves with it as well. Okay, so we've got the general rig teleporting to the right location and rotation, orientation, using the teleporter. So the next part is to be able to control this. So we don't actually want the camera spinning around and around like that, it will make us sick. So we'll set what angle we want this to be. If you grab a value slider, we can test this out and what it does. So if you send that into connector position, and we let this go to -1, let's pin that to the screen so it doesn't go flying off. So now we can actually send it a signal, and it will try to get to that point. but that's not very useful unless we have use limits. So we're going to say in this area, that's where the allowed rotation is. So it's actually pointing this way. So let's use the grid and align it to there. And now we can move these around. So if you put that down there and use triangle, make sure it's aligned correctly. This one's straight in front and this one's straight up. So now we've got 180 degrees of rotation. You can like change that if you want. And then when we send it a signal, play time first, then it will be going up or it'll be going down. So if we turn this down, you can see what's really happening. So as we change it, it's actually using this speed to move to that position. So 1 is at one end of the limits, and -1 is at the other end of the limits, and then 0 is in the middle. So we're going to create a value that we can control going into this setting here. So let's go and... So first we'll need a controller sensor so that we can actually get some... use the right stick, and we'll use the right stick local, because the right stick, normal right stick, is different depending on which direction you're looking at. So if you're looking here and you press up on the right stick, it will be pointing towards that direction over there. If you're looking at that in this direction, it will pushing up on the right stick will give you a value pointing over there. But we just want the actual right stick value. So we can use the right stick local. What we need to do then is if we grab a splitter and wire that in. So you can see this isn't just a single wire like this is. It's multiple wires all bundled into one. This is called a fat wire. And that means it contains multiple values. So it contains an X and a Y, as in left and right and up and down of what the right stick is doing. So if we use a number displayer, first we need to remember to turn this on to remote controllable in the important properties imp icon tab. And now if we play time, if we push more right on the stick, we get a higher number, left on the stick we get a lower negative number. And it's the same for up and down. So we want to use this to say, we want to use the Y component over here to say if we want it to move further up or further down. So for that, we want to be able to say what the speed is of it increasing or decreasing, basically. So for that, we can use a timer. So the timer normally just counts up towards the target time. But you can also use these other modes as speed mode. So if I demonstrate that, and we wire a value into start timer, we allow negative numbers. So now it's not actually moving because we're sending it the speed of 0. And if we send it the speed of 1, it will go 1 second for 1 second. But then if we give it a minus number, it will be going reverse. And so on. It just depends on, now it's going a really slow speed, things like that. So that's exactly the kind of function we want. So let's plug Y into the start timer. And now we will get out the other side. Out the other side of this we get the timer output. So we plug that into there. This is a percentage of, so if I give it some speed, you can see it increasing towards the percentage of this total value. So as this time increases, if you just play time and I just move that, so as it's full, it's 100%, and when it's empty, then it's a 0%, and then this is 50% because it's halfway to the target time. So if we set that to 1 second and set this to half of that, then that will give us 50%, which is what this connector is at. It's at 50% of the overall range. But remember, it wants to be -1 to 1. So let's just map that percentage to a different range using a signal manipulator. So now we can, a signal manipulator manipulates these signals in different ways. We're going to use the custom remapper version mode, which looks scary but really isn't. All we're going to use it for is this graph thing. So if we plug it in, at the moment it's waiting for a range between 0 and 1. Down here, 0 and 1, and then it's spitting out between 0 and 1. But we can stretch it. We can make it a smaller range. So now 0 will become 0.38, and 1 will become 0.8. Or we can stretch it out. So we want to stretch it out to 0 becomes -1, and 1 becomes 1, which is what this wants. So now let's just plug that in there. So now if we I'm holding L2 by the way to make it so that the stick doesn't actually do anything, and then pushing up and down, and it's setting a different target position for it. So I think it's actually the wrong way around, so we can just click on reverse direction, and that should work. So now pushing up moves the camera up, pushing down moves the camera down, and because we're starting in the middle of that timer, the camera starts in the middle as well. So now let's just increase this again, and it will be more snappy and one-to-one. We can see the camera is being teleported to the head, but then when we play, it's not in the head, and it's kind of, whoa, it's all going a bit weird. This is because cameras that are just hanging around in the scene, like this one, will only activate if they can see the puppet. Otherwise they'll deactivate themselves and you'll go back to the puppet's own default camera. So to fix that, all we need to do is tell Dreams that no matter what, that camera is meant to be on. So to do that, we can just add a switch and plug that straight into the camera's power, and now we play and we're stuck to that camera view, which doesn't look great right now because we haven't set it up yet. For now we can just scope into here. Let's just undo that. Right. And then select these and make them invisible. Now because we don't want these objects to collide and things like that, we have to turn that off. So we don't want it to be visible or collidable. And if we scope into here, we don't want this cube to be visible or collidable either. So now let's see what that looks like. That's a bit better. So we can still see our body down there, and we look up and around and stuff, and it works fine. If we go into the controller sensor and make this auto possess with force possession, then we're now in the puppet and we can move around and stuff, but it kind of moves away from us like that. So we can fix that by just tweaking a load of settings. So there's a lot of cool stuff in here that makes it lean and bounce as it walks and things like that, and also that it's got this running pose with extra parameters set. So if you do that, and now it works fine and it doesn't bounce up and down, but the controls are a bit weird, and we'll fix that now. So we can look up and down as we saw, look up and down just fine, but we can't look left and right because we're locked into this camera. So we want to do this, so we've got this set up where we're teleporting to the rotation of the puppet, so we can just rotate the puppet when we need to. So let's add a rotator and tweak the rotator, and we can go into the third tab and click affected objects and tell it to affect the puppet like that. And then we can turn on the grid and move that up so it rotates in a useful direction. And then we can, if we turn up the strength, then it will be immediate, and the damping, and you can adjust these however you want. And then we can plug this into this. Now I'll just explain what's going on there with another handy dandy value slider. So if I grab a wire and plug it into a value, into a slider that has a value that's not 0, you can see it's turning into an X. This means that value there is going to be multiplied by this value here that's coming into it. So half, so you can hover over it to see the full value, 180 degrees. So 0.5 times 180 degrees is 90 degrees. And you can change that with L1 and X to go to override, so it just sets it and things like that. But we just want it to multiply. This means that when we push a little bit on the little bit left, then it will be sending a small negative number, which means this will go all the way down to 0 and a small negative amount of 180. So if we just plug that in there and see how that looks. So it's going the wrong way around, but it's rotating okay. And if we look down, our puppet is rotating. Cool, so now let's go up here, and to kind of invert that, we can edit the original number to a negative number, and then that will just flip the whole thing. So if we use L1 and square, we can directly edit the actual number, and I'll just make it negative 180. And now try it. So I'm looking left and right, up and down, and that all works fine. We can run around, and I like to increase the speed, the deceleration and acceleration. So now this turn speed won't do anything because this rotator is controlling the speed that it's going. Right, so now I'll bring in that thing, our test area thing. Like that, and then see how it looks. So move around okay, and all seems to be fine, and jumping works. I'd like to thank DeadMC, RevPlayer, HyperDreamSurfer, and all of my other supporters for making this tutorial possible. Check out TAPgiles.com to find out how you can support me in helping Dreams creators. Thanks for your consideration, and I'll see you in the next one.